The story of Christianity in China is one of the most fascinating stories of all time. It is a story of arrival and expulsion, a story ultimately of tenacity and perseverance. This series seeks to understand the relationship between Christianity, the people, and the state in China. From an anthropological lens, this series seeks to understand the lived experience of Christians in the Middle Kingdom. In order to understand the lived experience of Christians in China, we need to understand context. Welcome to part 1 of Christianity with Chinese Characteristics, the history of Christianity in China. The story of Christianity in China begins not in China, but at the Council of Ephesus in 341 AD. In Ephesus, Christianity unequivocally rejected the Nestorian claim that Christ had a separation between his human and divine nature. The Council's decision in 341 resulted in the formation of the Nestorian movement. This movement was led by Nestorius, the bishop who argued in favor of the now heretical view of Christ's separate natures. In 451 CE, the Fourth Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon affirmed the teachings of Ephesus, and so Nestorianism was once again reaffirmed as heretical and cast out from mainline Christianity. As Christianity continued to spread, it pushed Nestorianism eastward, eventually into China. Some claim that Christianity arrived in China at the time of the Apostle Thomas, claiming that he went to China after establishing the church in India. Archaeologically speaking, the earliest known Chinese Christian artifact is known as the Nestorian seal, erected in 781 CE. The seal, or monument, describes the arrival of the earliest Nestorian Christians in China, dating back as far as 635 CE, with the arrival of Alapin of Syria. The Nestorians arrived during the reign of Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty. Emperor Taizong called the movement mysterious, wonderful, spontaneous, producing perception, establishing essentials for the salvation of creatures and the benefit of man. This endorsement from Emperor Taizong would establish the first phase of Christianity in China. Nestorianism would ride the coattails of this endorsement and integrate itself into Tang dynasty power structures. The Nestorian emphasis on integrating into power structures would, however, mark its downfall. In the year 845 CE, Emperor Wuzong of the Tang dynasty decreed that all foreign monks were to be deported from China. His edict was enacted and included the subsequent closing of Nestorian churches. It also included the loss of the Nestorian seal. Nestorianism would never see a return to prominence in China, though the Nestorian seal itself would eventually make a return in the 1620s CE. Between 845 and the 1600s, Christianity would enter a period of relative recession. Complete contact would not be cut off between China and Christianity. The Mongols, for example, had practitioners of Christianity that ended up in the Yuan dynasty. Furthermore, Franciscan missionaries would find themselves in China between the late 1200s and the mid-1300s. This contact would, however, be brief and unsustained. The second phase of Christianity would come with the arrival and spread of Catholicism in the 1600s. It is impossible to discuss this arrival and subsequent spread without discussing Jesuit Matteo Ricci. Ricci arrived in China in 1601 CE and worked to make Christianity understood culturally in China. To this end, he made the first ever European dictionary for Chinese. He dressed like a Buddhist and then later a Confucian scholar, and he worked to find proper Chinese words to express Christian theology. This way of making Christianity known in China was controversial, both outside of and within China. Outside of China, many Catholics found Ricci's approach to blending Christianity and Chinese culture as too radical. Within China, the emperor, Kangxi, was upset that the Vatican agreed and then decreed that Ricci's word for God Tianzhu would be the official word for God in Chinese. To this day, Catholicism, though not Christianity in general, is called the religion of Tianzhu, or Tianzhujia. Similar to the Nestorian approach, the Catholics of China aim to convert the elite members of Chinese society to Christianity. To this end, the Catholics found a hub in Beijing, the capital city of the Ming and subsequent Qing dynasties. During this second phase, there were fractured attempts at translating the Bible into Chinese. A Frenchman, Louis de Perot, even translated the entire New Testament and portions of the Old Testament into Chinese. However, the Pope never granted permission for the manuscripts to be released, and so they never were. The Qing dynasty would eventually kick out all missionaries, just as the Song dynasty had 800 years earlier. Preceding this expulsion, on 11 February 1724, Qing subjects were forbidden from practicing Christianity. A few Catholics were allowed to remain on the imperial court after the expulsion due to their prized knowledge. However, the century of growth and expansion experienced by Catholicism, growth that had converted 250,000 Qing dynasty subjects, had ended. Despite the best efforts of missionaries like Ricci to contextualize Christianity in China, it was never accepted as an indigenously Chinese religion due to the Catholic focus on the elite levels of society. Therefore, the second phase of Christianity in China had come to an end. The third phase of Christianity in China came in the 1800s with the arrival of Protestantism. Compared to the Nestorians and Catholics that came before them, the Protestant missionaries approached spreading Christianity in China from a bottom-up rather than a top-down perspective. These missionaries worked to expand Christianity in China, primarily by creating and then distributing a Chinese version of the Bible, alongside the first-ever Chinese to English dictionary. This bottom-up approach, in addition to improvements in areas such as science, technology, and social justice, led to Christianity having immense staying power in China. This phase of Christianity's contact with China was relatively short, lasting less than 50 years. However, the foundation and structure that was laid by the Protestants' focus on a bottom-up approach would directly enable and lead to the final phase of Christianity in China. The fourth and final phase of Christianity in China is marked by indigenization, which some call Sinicization. In essence, Christianity in China moved away from being a religion brought to China from outside powers and instead became a religion cultivated within China by Chinese citizens. The transition from the third to the fourth phase of Christianity in China was ominously begun by a rebellion, a civil war, known as the Taiping Rebellion. There aren't pictures from this time. There aren't paintings that depict individual acts of violence, because the Taiping Rebellion killed more people in China than World War I killed in its totality. But we don't have time for that. We'll circle back to Taiping another day. Suffice to say that the Taiping Rebellion was inspired by Christianity, as the leader of the Taiping Rebellion, Hong Xiuquan, claimed that he was the brother of Jesus Christ. Misery in China would continue with the Boxer Rebellion. It was deliberately an anti-Christian, pro-Qing, and anti-Western civil war that, combined with the previous Taiping Rebellion, would all but seal the fate of the weakened and dying Qing Empire. Ultimately, the Qing dynasty, China's last dynasty, would collapse in 1911, and therefore China would fall into a period of warlord states. As China broadly looked towards unity during this warlord state period, one figure stood out: Sun Yat-sen. He was a Christian and laid the foundations for a democratic China. Ironically, the two nation-states that followed in his footsteps, the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China, both trace their lineage to him. Sun Yat-sen during his time ruling the Republic of China, ensured that Christianity was broadly welcomed in China. After Sun Yat-sen's death, the following 20 years would see China embroiled in a civil war between the two major parties of the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. There would be a brief pause for the Second Sino-Japanese War, or, as we know it, the Pacific Theater in World War II, where both sides of the Chinese Civil War banded together to fight the Japanese. After Japan's defeat in 1945, the Civil War would continue all the way until 1949, where the People's Republic of China would emerge victorious after 22 years of fighting. During those 22 years, Christianity took a back seat. However, in the subsequent years to follow, Christianity would be in the crosshairs of the People's Republic. Understanding Christianity in the People's Republic of China provides the final piece of context needed to understand the everyday lives of Christians in modern-day China. This is because the true modern situations of Christians in China derives from the outcomes and after effects of the Chinese Civil War, the victory of the People's Republic of China, and subsequent social movements, laws, and regulations leading all the way up to the present day. The situation of Christians in China has ebbed and flowed even under the Communist Party of China, to the point where Mao Zedong's wife even exclaimed that, quote, Chinese Christianity was finished and belonged in the History Museum, end quote. To that end, there are three events to highlight in the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. The first is the establishment of the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. This church was originally founded on three self principles. The first self is self-governance, the second self-support, and the third self-propagation. The Three Self-Patriotic Movement effectively became the official touchpoint for Christianity and the party after its formation in 1954. The next major event worth highlighting is Pope John Paul II's canonization of Chinese martyrs in the year 2000. This represented a major break between the Chinese Communist Party and Christianity, specifically in Catholicism. The final major event worth highlighting is the 2018 revision on the Regulation on Religious Affairs. This policy dictates how citizens in China are allowed to practice and act out their religion, and therefore provides the last piece of context as it underpins the current legal standing of Christians in China. While the 2018 Regulation on Religious Affairs entitles citizens to the right of the freedom of religion, it does not necessarily entitle citizens to the right of free expression of religion. Places of worship are prescribed in this document, including both in person and online. Who people can talk about their religion with at what age is also regulated, and ultimately, in the regulation's own words, quote, the regulation is formulated with the goal of protecting citizens' freedom of religious belief, maintaining religious and social harmony, and regulating the management of religious affairs, end quote. The management of religious affairs and maintenance of social harmony are dangerous tools when wielded by an authoritarian state. Join me next time to shine light on how the management of religious affairs and maintenance of social harmony impacts the everyday lives of Christians in China as we seek to better understand Christianity with Chinese characteristics. The management of religious affairs and maintenance of social harmony when it comes to religion in China is an incredibly nuanced topic. This topic impacts people of all faiths in China, though today we'll be focusing on Christianity in particular. In order to do so, we'll be focusing on the three largest denominations of Christianity in China, namely Catholicism, Protestantism, and the Three Self Patriotic Movement. Before diving into the lived experience of the different Christian denominations within China, it is important to understand broad trends in geographic distribution for today's Chinese Christians. Rural areas in particular have seen both a resurgence and a decline. On the one hand, resurgence. Since 2000, these rural areas have seen churches reopening, which has coincided with the greater freedom, or at least tolerance, to practicing Christianity, stemming in large part from 1980s religious policies within China. However, there has also been a decline. In rural areas across China, millions of people migrate into the cities to look for work, which has led to a, quote, gradual hollowing out of the rural Christian community, end quote, and a decline in the number of people attending church services, as well as a perception that the church is more of a, quote, old folks club or a, quote, women's club. In essence, in the rural areas, we see that there has been a reopening of these churches, though at the same time there may not be as many people to attend these churches, as generally people have moved towards the cities. These cities play an important part in understanding the demographic distribution of Christianity in China. As China embraced the global markets in the 1990s, cities generally saw upticks in Christianity. A driving factor behind this was that increasingly Chinese citizens, though not necessarily the Chinese government, no longer saw Christianity as a foreign, Western imperialist religion, but instead as a, quote, prestigious religion that symbolizes modernity and cosmopolitanism, end quote. A coincidental factor to embracing the global markets was an internal suppression of dissent and tightening of political control as China showed itself to the world. As such, some Chinese citizens, quote, disenchanted with communist ideology, turned to Christianity as a viable source of religious and moral certitude, end quote. The exact composition of urban Christians in China is a continually developing story. Since the 1990s, there has been an interplay between urban Christians and rural migrant Christians, though recently, most urban Christian converts are from the, quote, elite strata of Chinese society, consisting of successful business people, university students, and professionals, end quote. A third domain also exists, transcending beyond the scope of urban and rural areas, the digital domain. While the Chinese Communist Party is able to monitor and censor online content with tools such as the Great Firewall, the digital domain remains a place of continued interaction amongst Chinese Christians. This line is a difficult line to walk for many Chinese Christians, and as a result, they must balance a tightrope of both appearing as patriotic Chinese netizens while also cultivating their identities as pious Christians. Per the Regulation on Religion 2018, these practices are oftentimes illegal since they do not typically receive approval by the religious affairs departments of government above the province level. For a final note on demography, a broad understanding of the Christian population is necessary. Pew Research estimates that in 2021, accounting for the reduced scope of the survey due to the COVID-19 pandemic in China, potentially 2% of China's population, or around 30 million people, are Christian, though some sources push that number up to as high as 9%, or 125.47 million people. The vast majority are Protestant. And out of the at least 26 million Protestant Christians in China, 70% of them live in rural areas. Furthermore, it is estimated that up to 80% of house church members in China are female, likely due in part to the demolition of Confucian patriarchal systems during the Cultural Revolution. This is likely also a reason why rural Christian churches are culturally regarded as women's clubs. And finally, as a result of the dispersed nature of Christianity in China, there is an acute problem of not having enough pastors and educated ministers to meet the needs of the entire Chinese Christian population. Moving now towards the different denominations in modern Chinese Christianity, it is important to note, as with all religions in China, Christianity is tolerated as long as it is kept under the monitor of the Chinese government. These denominations present a challenge to the Chinese government, and that is of foreign, which can also be read as non-Chinese, influence. As such, we will now begin to discuss the lived experience of the three major denominations in China: Catholicism, Protestantism, and the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. Catholicism in China is largely consolidated under the China Catholic Patriotic Church, the CCPC, also sometimes called the China Catholic Patriotic Association, or CCPA. Notably, it is not largely consolidated under the Holy See in the Vatican. Now, this led to a situation where in September 2018, Pope Francis signed an agreement with the Chinese government to appeal to the underground churches to unify with the CCPC, which led to many of these underground bishops stepping down in favor of bishops appointed by the CCPC. Two things are important to note regarding this situation. First is that these underground churches are not necessarily literally underground, more so that they do not approve of CCPC and or governmental oversight, and as such do not conform to traditional church structure. Second, it is important to understand that despite being appointed by the Chinese government, many Catholic clergy in the CCPC are indeed devout Christians and not necessarily trying to push a Chinese Communist Party agenda on the church. This nuance means that for many Catholic clergy in China, their lived daily experience consists of, quote, playing according to the rules in order to cultivate good relationships with local governments, avoid the suspicion of authorities, and to protect their own communities, end quote. Ultimately, all of this is an effort to foster an image of Catholics being patriotic Chinese citizens so that they can safeguard their ability to practice Christianity, as in reality, quote, the open church has little choice but to follow the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, end quote. This brings a dichotomy to the Catholic Church in China, as many of the policies enacted by the state are targeted at clergy members and not necessarily at the non-clergy practitioners of the faith, the laity. Of course, there are policies that impact the day-to-day practicing of religion just broadly in China, but, quote, the clergy are more directly influenced by the regulation and any top-down changes as they are the people who organize the church and its activities. The laity can be considered more as passive agents than active agents, end quote. So while the Catholic clergy certainly faces challenges, as alluded to, the laity has a little bit more maneuver room. For example, the Church of Little Rome was rebuilt in a village in Guangdong province with funding from members of the Hakka diaspora. This church was not merely built for religious reasons. Villagers used religion in this case to pursue modern development while they dealt with topics such as, quote, economic migration, consumption, and nation-state building, end quote, as a broader part of their interpretation and experience of being modern in the contemporary world. However, the tightening of control by the government on the church projects a relatively bleak outlook for the CCPC's trajectory of religious freedom. As the regulation on religious affairs has tightened restrictions, and during the Xi Jinping era of governance, there has been a tightening of the PRC's Article 5 of the Constitution that pronounces the rule of law, or Fa in Mandarin. One of the hardest hit denominations is and will be the CCPC, due to their already stringent oversight by the Chinese government. In this instance, the hierarchical nature of the CCPC has led to a situation ripe for government oversight and control. And to this end, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has instituted a clergy database that monitors and tracks how closely clergy members follow CCP regulations. And so, especially sparked by events such as Pope John Paul II's canonization of Chinese martyrs, a yearly feast on July 9th that is marked in remembrance of 120 Catholic martyrs from China, such as Augustine Jiaorong. The Chinese government has seen this event and deemed that foreign influence of the Catholic Church cannot be ignored and therefore must be conformed to Chinese rule of law. This idea of foreign influence in the Chinese Catholic Church specifically is one of the driving factors, in fact, the main factor for all of the stringent rules and regulations surrounding the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Church, and therefore underpinning the relatively bleak trajectory of religious freedom for Catholics in China. Moving now to Protestant Christianity in China, referred to as Jidujiao, or the Jesus religion in Chinese. Protestantism is the largest of the three denominations, and in part this is because of a few institutional features of Protestantism. One feature that works well with Protestantism in China is the fact that there is an insistence on church autonomy, so there's not typically a bigger superstructure above local churches. Another factor that works very well for Protestantism in China is a global support network. So what I talked about earlier, how the Chinese Communist Party, fearing global influence or international and foreign influence in the church, well, Protestantism, since it is more decentralized, has a better access and a less restricted access to that outside world. And finally, there's other factors, for example, the glorification of martyrdom, that all come to play together in essentially making Protestantism, as it is now, the largest of the denominations in China. Now, if you've heard about Christianity in China, you've likely heard of the house church movement. This is a pretty strong pillar in the Protestant movement writ large in China, and is very similar to the underground church movement for Catholic Christians in China, essentially not formally registering with the government. Now, the house church movement typically takes place in people's houses where sermons and lectures and Christianity is practiced. Now, for that, this house church movement comes with benefits and drawbacks. On one hand, the lack of governmental oversight allows for Protestants to practice a relatively more free version of Christianity because they're not being overseen by the government. On the other hand, the Chinese government views this Protestantism, and specifically the house church movement, with intense suspicion, not only because of the lack of direct government oversight, but also due to the connections that Protestant groups have within China with countries such as South Korea and the United States, and therefore the Protestant movements in those countries. As a result, arrests and even torture of Protestant leaders in China is not entirely uncommon. In recent memory, this has looked like the arrest of Pastor Wang Yi in 2018 for his part in authoring a statement against the 2018 Regulation on Religious Affairs, as well as Pastor Geng Zijun in 2022 due to his affiliation with the broader house church movement. Despite the hardships, many Protestant Christians continue to practice their faith in China. For example, many Protestant Christians use their places of work as a place to practice their religion. For example, working to change workplace culture, engaging with coworkers through the lens of Protestant Christianity, which ultimately kind of blurs the line a little bit between occupation and religion, with the ultimate aim of a moral transformation of China through the means of Christianity. Now, this is not entirely a united movement or a united front. Due to the decentralized structure of Protestantism in China, there's a kaleidoscope of approaches to the interdenominational and even inter-Protestant cooperation and coordination. As Protestant churches spread throughout China in the post-Mao era, they took on forms and shapes of their own. Some Protestant churches in China are Calvinist, some are Pentecostal, and some are exclusionary, while others work with the Three Self-Patriotic movement or even the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Church. So this fragmentary nature of Protestantism compounds the aforementioned weakness of the general non-hierarchical structure of Christianity in China. Simply put, Protestant Christians in China do not necessarily have a broad unity of effort in the same way that, say, Chinese Catholics do, nor do they have that unified support network to fall back on. And as a result, the Chinese government continues to heavily scrutinize and conduct coercive actions against Protestant groups. Last group that we'll look at in particular before giving some broad overall strokes is the Three Self-Patriotic movement, or the 三自爱国运动, which literally translates to Three Self-Patriotic Movement. Now, the TSPM, as it's also referred to, represents a bit of an enigma for Christianity outside of China. It's technically a Protestant denomination in a very loose sense of the word, as it's not Catholic. It was formed in 1954, and it is the official non-Catholic church in China, and generally stands today as a counterpoint to the Protestant churches previously mentioned. Some notes on that is that the church is and was led by the CCP, and to that end, the original slogan of the TSPM was "Love Country, love church. The ordering of that phrase is highly intentional, the fact that country comes before church. Now, certainly the CCP has exerted immense control over the TSPM, and to that end, an article of union among the TSPM stated that, among other not traditionally Christian edicts, quote, all books used in the interpretation of the Bible shall be examined and judged. Only teachings favoring union and socialism shall be used. There shall be no more teaching about the last day or about the vanity of this world, end quote. Now, to paint the Three Self-Patriotic movement as a merely brutish attempt by the CCP to exert its power and influence over Christians in China is not a nuanced enough picture. Similar to how the Catholic clergy are kind of playing according to the rules in order to shirk attention and find breathing room to actually truly practice their faith, the same can be said for many TSPM practitioners. That being said, there is a general trend in the TSPM to view themselves as a main source of Protestant orthodoxy within China, alongside the CCPC as the main source for Catholic orthodoxy. In other words, they see themselves, the TSPM, as the correct way of doing Christianity as it relates to the Protestant sphere of influence. Now, this view of itself is a factor that spreads mistrust between the TSPM and non-TSPM Protestant house churches, as the TSPM maintains a level of awareness of the so-called heterodox tendencies of other denominations, and again paints itself as the orthodox way of practicing Christianity through Protestantism within China. Despite everything, though, despite generally falling in line with the CCP, despite having massive CCP oversight and structure there, not even the TSPM has been spared violent action against it by the Chinese state. For example, in 1973, Three Self-Patriotic Movement Pastor Wang Zhiming, an early TSPM advocate, was publicly executed alongside 21 other Christians. Further, during the Cultural Revolution, overt practices of Christianity, to include the TSPM, were so non-existent to the point where Mao Zedong's wife exclaimed that, quote, Chinese Christianity was finished and belonged in the History Museum, end quote. Other injustices have been conducted against the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. For example, there have been TSPM churches that have had their crosses removed, though, of course, this is a commonality amongst all Chinese Christian denominations. That being said, though, the TSPM has proved resilient as the CCP sees use to the institution, and TSPM practitioners see this specific denomination as a valid way of exercising their faith. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit here about the broad-lived interdenominational experience, so experiences common to Christians of any denomination in China, and then talk about some of the challenges that they face, as well as Christianity's current standing in China. One generally shared experience is the fact that, at least among the common people in China, Christianity is not necessarily considered a foreign religion anymore, which is a rather remarkable change that has come with over 1,400 years of intermittent contact between China and Christianity. Simply put, Chinese Christianity did not stick for, as I mentioned in the last video, 3 out of 4 major phases of sustained contact since 635 CE. And as such, the fact that there is a trend towards Christianity be considered not just a foreign religion, but now another Chinese religion represents a historical anomaly. One other experience that is common across denominations is the fact that Chinese Christians have been very creative in finding ways to meet. I mentioned earlier that the digital world provides one avenue of approach for Chinese Christians to meet, though of course in the face of CCP resistance. Another avenue has been the renting and co-opting of commercial spaces, even though, again, this practice is widely illegal. To this end, there have been Christian protests of government crackdowns on religious venues. This was openly showcased in 2001 when members of the Shouwang Church were forced to leave their church. As a result, they protested by holding outdoor services. This points to another general trend among all Christian denominations in China. They have, quote, with varying degrees of agency, creativity, and autonomy, have either accommodated, resisted, or co-opted the party state through innovations in theology, organization structure, technology, ritual practices, and transnational social networks, end quote. As for specific challenges that Christians face in China, it is not unfair to say that modern Chinese Christians face levels of persecution unseen in the West. In modern China, these anti-Christian acts are committed in line with Xi Jinping's 2019 policy of Sinicization that seeks to ensure that all religions in China understand that the Chinese Communist Party is first, and any actions taken by religious groups must conform to socialist societal practices. This comes in tandem with an uptick in specifically anti-Christian acts by the CCP to include, quote, church raids, confiscation of church property and personal assets of Christians, demolitions of churches, political vetting of seminary students, and torture of clergy and laity, end quote, in both official and unofficial capacities. Technology also plays a role in the lives of Chinese Christians. For example, churches are required to have facial ID, and compounding this small fact of facial ID when you walk into a church and check in is the fact that a lot of the infrastructure that was used initially to track COVID-19 in China, such as telephone tracking, surveillance cameras, and, as I mentioned, the facial ID outside of churches, are now being used to track underground and home churches as well. Another method of tracking Christians in China comes in the form of the previously mentioned clergy database, where, quote, Christian leaders are ordered to swear loyalty to the CCP and conform the content of their homilies to the party line, and churches and religious organizations are required to report the conduct of their religious leaders to local authorities, who in turn would administer the clergy's rewards and punishment register to them in the database, end quote. Now, this is being conducted in an effort to ensure that only politically sound individuals, as according to the CCP, are allowed to attend and participate in official Christian activities. This mixing of government and religion is not merely external. It's not just something that stops once you go through the church doors of whatever denomination you happen to practice in China. The CCP demands that churches sing the national anthem and give praise to CCP leaders before worship. This internal meddling by the CCP goes further. Churches are required to substitute Christian iconography for portraits of Xi Jinping and are required to, quote, notify the Religious Affairs Department of personnel changes as well as important meetings, activities, trainings, and international communications, end quote. On top of all of this, and as aforementioned, arrests, physical harassment and violence, as well as psychological harassment perpetrated by the CCP are not uncommon if a member or a congregation steps outside of the party line. This has been recognized within China, again, as I mentioned, with numerous arrests of Chinese pastors and clergy from every denomination, though it has also been recognized outside of China. Places like the Vatican, for example, have recognized it by Pope John Paul's recognition of Chinese martyrs, or more recently, the United States State Department calling for the release of arrested pastors such as Wang Yi. In conclusion for this video and this little mini-series, the research available suggests a nuanced picture of Christianity in China. From its history and all the way down to the lived experience of Chinese Christians today, we see that Christianity in China is certainly a difficult road for Chinese Christians to navigate. On one hand, there is systemic and targeted persecution of Christians by Chinese authorities, though on the other, the fact that Christianity has maintained its presence in China suggests that despite the hardships and the challenges associated with practicing the faith, there are aspects of Christianity that are worth it to tens of millions of Chinese citizens. To this end, and despite the hardship, Christianity continues to grow in China. And as long as the CCP finds Christianity in line, or at least manageable with social harmony, as they would put it, in addition to modernization, a return to the pre-1976 massively widespread and overt targeting of Christians will likely be avoided, and Christianity's growth in China will be sustained. One final point that I'd like to leave you with comes from Ye 2023, where they note the general resiliency of Chinese Christians rather succinctly. Quote, 3 times in history Christianity came and died, and 3 times it came back to life. End quote. Hey folks, thank you so much for watching these videos. For longtime viewers of the channel, you might know that this is originally was 2 videos and now it's 1 video, so I owe that explanation. First off, I really I know that people fall asleep watching to YouTube videos, and if that is you, like I don't want you to have to go from like one video to another video. Um, if you want to continue learning about Christianity with Chinese characteristics. So I've decided, I made the exact decision to just make it all into one video. And honestly, like I really did try something new with these videos. First off, I split it up. Second off, there's a little bit of artistic flair. I mean, like the first video, I'm kind of like talking really sad and almost more monotone. And then, of course, later in the videos, I kind of cheer up a little bit. And that was an artistic choice. So maybe it's weird to hear me speak in my normal cadence or tone. But um, anyways, a lot of experimenting going on with these videos. And here's the last part of that experimentation. And here's why. I've said not even close to all that there is to be said on the anthropological side of things. And this is a series I would like to continue talking about, not just Christianity in China, though I would probably focus more that way, but indeed on the rest of the religious experience in China. But and not just China, of course. My background was Asian studies, and then later anthropology for my master's. So focusing on other areas of the world, India and Russia come to mind as places I'd like to focus on. But also in addition to all of the anthropology that I've just mentioned, I'm interested in the faith experience specifically. And this is where the video gets its last thing that I'm trying out, as I'm trying out all these things in video. I have said, like a bit on the anthropological side, and I'll continue to say stuff there. But I'd also like to say a piece on the faith side. So coming explicitly from a religious perspective, something I've never shared publicly like this. So forgive me if it's not perfect or anything, but I'd like to talk about how we should view this topic as Christians, or at least some of my thoughts on how we should view this topic, because of course it's nuanced and it's expansive. So let's jump into it. So some of my views here as a Christian are actually impacted by the time that I was in China. I visited back in 2017. I was there as a youth ambassador, and I stayed with a host family. So what all that means is I stayed with some people in China that were Chinese. And towards the end of the trip, they actually asked me. They asked me about Christianity. They asked me about my faith. They had never met a Christian before. So if I was a little older and a little wiser and a little bit more well-versed in Christianity, I would have been able to give them a good answer. In fact, I'm looking at it here. I have a New Testament Bible that is in English and it's in Chinese that I brought with me to that trip, and I didn't leave it with that family. They were clearly interested. They wanted to learn more about Christianity. That would have been a perfect segue. Be like, actually, now that you ask, I have a little something for you. But I didn't, because I was scared. Scared for a couple of reasons. One, just socially scared. There are certainly times in my life where I can be an awkward person to engage with, and in that moment, I was a person of awkwardness to myself, and I guess I got in my head there in terms of like, well, would they like that? Would they get mad at me? Would they kick me out of the house? I don't know. And two, I had this perception that it was illegal to give a Bible to them, and of course, to an extent, I'm sure you can find or at least string together some laws that, there's a level of illegality to that. That being said, that would have taken the host family to report me and the authorities to be like, yeah, okay, let's arrest a guy, and then me be arrested, and like that started potentially an international incident over, that like maybe not. I don't know. Hard to say. Of course, this was 2017 China. I think right now in China, it would be a lot easier to just snipe someone for that. So All that to say, I was scared and I didn't give that to them. But that experience, upon some reflection, has taught me a couple of things, and it leads into and it connects to this whole kind of trend of Christianity with Chinese characteristics, and it's this: um, people in China are interested in Christianity. I'll say that again. People in China are interested in the Christianity that I practice, the one that is a daily a daily thing for me, a moment by moment thing for me. They are genuinely interested in that experience. They're interested in what I perceive and what honestly, I'm not even going to say that, what is objective truth. They are interested in that. And that is powerful. That is incredibly powerful. And it's something that I wish I would have keyed into better then. Okay, so what? What does that mean for us today as Christians sitting ostensibly somewhere comfy at home or maybe laying in bed? And sorry for raising my voice. Especially if you're trying to sleep, I apologize for that. But what does that mean for us, us Christians here? In the U.S. or in the West, broadly speaking, at least I assume if we've gotten this far and it's still all in English, but well, I think there's two things we can do, and I think we can be very, very intentional about these things. The first is to pray for the people of China, and that is a broad and expansive category. I think we can split it up maybe in our heads into two fairly simple categories. The first is for our Christian brothers and sisters who are actively being persecuted in China. I gave a bunch of examples in the video, so if you need more, just go back and listen to those. Maybe I'll talk about more in the future, and there are plenty of examples of persecution, past and present in China. But pray for them. Pray that they would have the strength and the guidance and the wisdom to navigate their circumstances, and to run the race well, in whatever capacity that looks like for them. And I think that the second category of pray for the Chinese people would be the majority of Chinese people who have probably, in all reality, not had a true experience with the gospel, with the message of Jesus. And as I'll boldly proclaim, with objective truth. Because what the Communist Party of China is pushing on its people is not objective truth. It's a subjective reality, but just because it's that doesn't make it true. So I would pray for the Chinese people there. Of course, that brings us to our second thing that we can do, which is pray for the Chinese leadership. If the people in China had it their way, and if it's anything like the anecdotal experience that I had, I think people in China would be pretty open to religion. I mean, look at Chinese history. Maybe that's something I can do for another video. Like, Chinese history is filled with religion. I don't think that, if the Communist Party didn't exist, I don't think that the Chinese people would be entirely opposed to having a bigger population of Christians in China. Like, I don't think that that's impossible at all. And yet, because of the Chinese Communist Party, religion in general in China is looked at as evil, actually. I mean, that's probably the best way to put it. That's how the Chinese Communist Party puts it. So that's how I'll put it. They view religion as these evil cults, essentially, from a government perspective. And I've talked at length at how the government not only views that, but, how all the mechanisms in which that is enacted. So be it the facial recognition or changing verses of the Bible to fit a Communist Party narrative, because you can't talk about all of these things. That's not, it's not right. Jesus is going to offend our communist sensibilities. But I would pray for the people specifically in leadership positions in China, and we'll just make it blunt. Pray for Xi Jinping. Pray for the people in China with decision-making power to make the lives of Christians better in China. Because right now, with the Chinese Communist Party, it is objectively a worse life. And all you have to do for a comparison is look at how Christians live in a country like the United States or in Europe, and compare that to how Christians live, or even a country like Japan or Taiwan or South Korea, if we want a more direct East Asian example. But indeed, in China, there's a level of persecution there, and it's perpetrated by the people in power in the Chinese government. So I would pray for them as well. So one final thought on prayer in general, and then another general thought. First, for prayer, right now I think prayer in our societal discourse has a bit of a negative connotation, at least here in the United States. I can't speak for other countries, but something will happen. Choose something bad that happens in the news, and people say, "Well, thoughts and prayers," and people are like, "I don't want your thoughts and prayers. Get that crap out of here." From the Christian perspective, obviously, prayers are a mechanism. They have a mechanistic property to them, so it's not just a passive act. Indeed, it is active. But for those who might not believe in that, I would at least suggest, well, even if you don't believe in the mechanism of prayer, that's your prerogative. But at the same time, I don't think it's a bad thing if we have people, Christians or any other religion in the U.S., orienting themselves towards the plight of people in a different country, in a different government system that speak a different language, in practicing that empathy with them, and that attempt at understanding their struggles that they're going through. I don't think that that's bad anywhere we speak. I mean, especially as we look in the broader context of maybe something like U.S.-China relationships, having some true empathy for the people of China, I think, is highly valuable right now, because it's way too easy to go online and see something incredibly hateful or derogatory towards the Chinese people. And if we have an ounce of empathy, goes a very long way. But I would say, as Christians, and I would say boldly as Christians, we should be praying for the people of China and for the leaders of China, so that whether there are brothers and sisters that are currently being persecuted in China, or they're the general Chinese populace who hasn't encountered truth, hasn't encountered the gospel, hasn't encountered the word of God, the message of Jesus, that they truly would, whether that's at the level of you and me, the average Joe in China, or if it's the level at their leaders. We should pray for them, and we should really, really take that seriously right now. And the other thing I was going to talk about is we should be bold about it, and we shouldn't be afraid to either A, learn more, or B, act when we have the opportunity to. So if you want to learn more about Christianity in China, I will continue to publish videos here. But if you want a more real, a tangible thing that you can do in your life, like wherever you live, in whatever city you live in, there's probably a Chinese church not that far away from you. You'd be surprised. You would be surprised. I've seen Chinese churches in the middle of nowhere in the United States, and they are Christians, and they just so happen to speak Mandarin. So don't be intimidated. I'm sure they would love to tell you more about their experiences, especially if they came from China, or if they're American-born Chinese, if they had family members in China. I'm sure for European-born Chinese people as well, I'm sure that they would love to tell you about their family story, how they came to faith, share their testimony. So there's that aspect. But speaking to me, but I'm speaking to you too. If you get the chance to hand people of any faith a Bible, because they're truly and indeed interested in Christianity, learn from my story, learn from my time in Suzhou, and despite the social pressure, despite maybe even the government pressure, hand them the Bible. So with all that, I know this is very different than anything I've ever done on the channel. Thanks for entertaining me here, and letting me speak my mind. I will, at least in part, continue to speak from a faith perspective, just going forward in general, because I think it's important. But of course, I will indeed demarcate that, like I did here. I think it's important to look at things from a critical anthropological lens, though I also think it's important to look at things from a critical faith-based lens. So with that, thank you for your time. I know this went, this is a little bonus extra that you probably weren't expecting, but thank you for your time and for hanging out here on the channel. So if you like what you see, stick around. If not, I don't blame you. Anyways, wherever you are, be safe, take care, and until next time, bye-bye.